It doesn't usually begin with something obvious. There's no sudden collapse, no dramatic announcement, nothing that clearly signals that something is being taken from you. It starts quietly, almost in a way that can be ignored if you're not paying attention. A door that doesn't open the way it used to. A connection that fades without conflict. A flow that once felt natural suddenly feels interrupted, like something unseen has shifted direction without asking for your permission. At first, it feels like a phase. You tell yourself it will pass, that things will return to how they were. But they don't. And what once felt like stability begins to feel unfamiliar, almost distant, as if you've been moved into a different version of your own life without being told why. There's a moment, subtle but unmistakable. Yes, when you realize this isn't random. Something is changing, and it's not just around you. It's within you. The things you used to rely on no longer carry the same weight. The support you counted on isn't as present. The ease you once experienced now feels replaced by resistance. And the question begins to surface, not loudly, but persistently. Why? Not why things are difficult, but why things are being removed. Because it doesn't feel like chaos. Chaos is loud, disorganized, messy. This feels precise, almost intentional, as if something is being stripped away, layer by layer, but not in a way that destroys you, in a way that exposes you. And exposure is uncomfortable. It reveals things you didn't realize you were leaning on, not just materially, but internally. Patterns, dependencies, yes, invisible structures that gave you a sense of control. And as those structures begin to dissolve, something deeper starts to emerge. But it doesn't feel like emergence. It feels like loss. There's a tension that builds when what you have begins to shrink. Not just in quantity, but in certainty. You start to question your path, your decisions, even your identity. Because when resources fade, they don't just take away comfort. They take away the version of you that was built around them. And that's where the confusion deepens. Because you weren't moving away from purpose. You were getting closer. And yet, instead of expansion, you experience reduction. Instead of increase, there's subtraction. And nothing in your logic can explain why moving forward feels like moving backward. This is where most people misinterpret the moment. And they assume something went wrong, that they missed a sign, that they made a mistake. Because the mind has been trained to associate growth with accumulation. More support, more clarity, more opportunity. But what if that pattern doesn't apply here? What if this isn't about gaining, but about refining? There's a kind of clarity that only appears when excess is removed. Not because excess is bad, but because it can hide things. It can create noise. It can give the illusion of strength when, in reality, it's just cushioning uncertainty. And when that cushioning is taken away, what remains is raw, unfiltered, real. That's the part that feels uncomfortable. Because now, you're no longer surrounded by what once reinforced you. You're left with what's actually inside you. And that confrontation is not easy. Yes, there's a silence that follows reduction. A kind of quiet that isn't peaceful at first. It's unsettling. Because in that silence there are no distractions, no external confirmations. Just you, and the awareness that something is being restructured in a way you don't fully understand. And this is where the story begins to mirror something ancient. Not in a distant, symbolic way, but in a pattern that repeats itself more often than people realize. Because there was a moment when a man stood in a place of uncertainty, not because he lacked potential, but because everything around him seemed insufficient. The numbers didn't make sense. The odds were against him. And yet, instead of being given more, he was asked to move forward with less. At first, it seemed irrational, almost contradictory. Why reduce what already feels limited? Why take away what seems necessary? But what if what seems necessary isn't actually essential? There's a difference between what supports you and what defines you. And sometimes, the line between those two becomes blurred. What starts as support slowly turns into identity. And when that identity is built on external things, it becomes fragile. Not because it's weak, but because it's dependent. So when those external things begin to fall away, it feels like you're losing yourself. But what's actually happening is something far more precise. You're being separated from what you thought you needed, so you can see what you actually carry. And that realization doesn't come instantly. It unfolds, slowly, through moments that don't seem connected at first. A delay here, a closed door there, and a shift in direction that doesn't align with your expectations. Each moment, on its own, feels insignificant. But together, they create a pattern of reduction that isn't random, but selective. Because not everything is being removed, only what interferes. And interference doesn't always look negative. Sometimes, it looks like advantage, like convenience, like something that makes things easier. But ease isn't always alignment, and advantage isn't always preparation. There are moments when having too much keeps you from seeing clearly. And clarity is not comfortable when it first appears. It removes illusion. It exposes truth. And truth, when it's no longer filtered, can feel sharp. That's why the process feels like tension. Because something in you is adjusting, letting go of what felt certain, as releasing what once felt safe, not by choice, but by necessity. And necessity has a way of revealing priorities. When everything is available, it's easy to move without awareness, to act without depth, to rely on what's accessible rather than what's meaningful. But when access is limited, something shifts. You become intentional. Every decision carries weight. Every movement becomes deliberate. Because now, you're not operating from abundance. You're operating from precision. And precision requires presence. It pulls you into the moment in a way that excess never could. It removes the option of distraction. It forces you to engage with what's in front of you, fully, without escape. That's where something begins to change. Not outside, but inside. Because when you're no longer supported by what you used to depend on, whilst you begin to discover a different kind of strength. Not one that comes from accumulation, but one that comes from clarity. A strength that isn't loud, but steady. Not visible, but undeniable. And yet, even as this strength begins to form, the external situation may not reflect it. Things may still look limited, still feel uncertain, still appear as if something is missing. But what's missing might have been the very thing that was in the way. And that's the part few people understand. Because it requires seeing beyond the surface, beyond what's visible, beyond what can be measured. It requires trusting a process that doesn't explain itself in real time. And that kind of trust isn't easy. It doesn't come from comfort. It comes from tension. From moments where nothing makes sense, but something within you refuses to turn back. Well, because even in the reduction, there's movement. Not always forward in the way you expect, but deeper, more aligned, more real. And somewhere in that depth, a shift happens. You stop asking why things are being taken, and start noticing what remains. Not just physically, but internally. What's still there when everything else begins to fade? What part of you hasn't changed, even as everything around you has? That's where the answer begins. Not in what was removed, but in what couldn't be. And that's where the story is still unfolding. And once you begin to notice what remains, something subtle starts to reorganize inside you. It's not a sudden shift, not a moment of clarity that changes everything overnight. It's quieter than that, almost imperceptible at first. A different way of looking at what's left, a different weight given to things that once felt small or insignificant. Because when everything else is stripped back, what remains is no longer competing for your attention. It stands alone. And in that space, you begin to see it differently. What used to feel like not enough starts to feel precise, almost intentional, as if what's left wasn't random survival, but careful selection. And that realization doesn't come as comfort right away. It comes as tension again, but a different kind of tension. One that carries awareness instead of confusion. Because now the question changes. It's no longer, why is this being taken away? It becomes, why is this still here? And that question goes deeper than most people expect, because it forces you to confront something that was always there, but never fully seen. The part of you that doesn't depend on circumstances to exist. The part that doesn't fluctuate with gain or loss. The part that remains consistent, even when everything else becomes uncertain. That part begins to take shape, not as an idea, not as a belief, but as something experienced, something lived. And yet, at the same time, the external reality might still look reduced. Opportunities may still feel limited. Support may still seem distant. The numbers may still not make sense. And that contrast between what's forming inside and what's visible outside creates a strange kind of friction. Because now, you can feel something building, but you can't fully explain it. It's like standing in a place where you know something is happening, but there's no evidence you can point to, no validation you can show, just an internal shift that doesn't match the external situation. And this is where many people hesitate, because the instinct is to go back, to try to recover what was lost, to rebuild the same structures that once gave a sense of security, to return to what felt stable, even if it wasn't aligned. But something in you resists that, not loudly, not forcefully, just enough to make you pause. Because once you've seen what remains, you can't unsee it, unsee. And going back would mean ignoring something that now feels true in a way you can't fully describe. This is where the pattern deepens. Because the reduction wasn't just about removing excess, it was about creating contrast. A contrast strong enough to make you see clearly, to separate what was always yours from what was only surrounding you. And that separation is not comfortable. It challenges identity. It questions assumptions. It removes the safety of familiar definitions. Because now, you're no longer defined by what you have. You're confronted with who you are without it. And that's where something unexpected begins to emerge. A kind of focus, not forced, not artificial, but natural. As if your attention is no longer scattered across multiple directions, as if everything unnecessary has been filtered out, while leaving only what truly matters. And with that focus comes a different kind of movement. Not fast, not expansive, but precise. Every step becomes intentional. Every choice carries awareness. Because now, there's no room for excess movement, no space for distraction. What you do matters in a way it didn't before, and that changes how you move. You stop reacting and start responding. You stop chasing and start discerning. You stop relying and start recognizing what is aligned. and what only appears to be. Because when resources are abundant, it's easy to move without clarity, to follow paths that feel good but don't lead anywhere meaningful, to say yes to things that don't actually serve you. But when resources are limited, something shifts. You become selective, not out of fear, but out of awareness. Yes, and that awareness begins to reshape everything, even the way you perceive lack. Because what once felt like deprivation now begins to reveal itself as direction. Not because it suddenly feels good, but because it starts to make sense in a way that goes beyond logic. You begin to see that not everything that leaves was meant to stay, and not everything that stays was meant to be overlooked. That's when the tension starts to transform. It doesn't disappear, but it changes texture. It becomes less about confusion and more about unfolding, less about resistance and more about alignment. Because now, you're no longer fighting the reduction. You're observing it. And observation creates space. Space to see patterns. Space to notice connections. And space to understand that what seemed like isolated moments were actually part of a sequence. A sequence that wasn't designed to weaken you, but to position you. Position you in a way where what remains is not just enough, but exactly what's required. And that realization begins to shift something deeper. Because now, the focus is no longer on what's missing, but on what's possible with what's here. And that's where something begins to activate. Not externally, yet, but internally, undeniably. A sense of readiness. Not because everything is in place, but because you are. And that readiness doesn't need confirmation. It doesn't depend on conditions. It exists even in uncertainty, even in limitation, even when nothing around you seems to support it, because it's no longer coming from what you have. Yet it's coming from what you've become, through what was removed. And that changes everything. Because now the question isn't whether you have enough. It's whether you can see clearly enough to use what remains. And that's where the story of reduction reveals something few people truly grasp. It was never about taking away your strength. It was about removing everything that made you think your strength was somewhere else. And once that illusion begins to dissolve, what's left is something that can't be reduced. Something that doesn't fluctuate. Something that doesn't depend. Something that was always there, waiting to be seen. And now, it is. And it's right at this point, when everything feels reduced to almost nothing, that the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. Because this is exactly where Gideon found himself. Not in a place of strength, not surrounded by abundance, not stepping into something that made sense on paper. He was hidden, positioned in a space that didn't reflect potential, but limitation. And even there, the message that reached him didn't match his reality. He was called mighty, while feeling anything but. That contradiction is easy to overlook when reading the story from a distance. But inside the moment, it doesn't feel poetic. It feels disorienting. Because how can you be addressed as strong when everything around you suggests weakness? That's the first fracture in perception. Because what he was being called had nothing to do with what he currently had. And that's where most people miss what was really happening. Gideon wasn't chosen because he had resources. He wasn't positioned because he had advantage. In fact, everything about his situation pointed in the opposite direction. Limited, uncertain, outnumbered, and yet he was being moved forward. Not gradually, not cautiously, but deliberately. And then comes the part that few truly sit with. When the numbers started to gather, when the possibility of strength began to form, it didn't stay that way. It was reduced, again and again, not by loss in battle, not by external attack, but by instruction. That's what makes it different. Because this wasn't something happening to him. It was something being done through him. The men who stood with him, who represented safety, reinforcement, probability, they were dismissed. Not because they were weak, not because they weren't capable, but because their presence was interfering with something deeper, something that couldn't coexist with excess. Imagine standing there, watching what little support you had begin to shrink. Not by accident, but on purpose. Watching what seemed necessary being removed, step by step, until what remained looked almost insufficient. 300. Not 3,000. Not even a fraction that would make sense against the scale of what stood ahead. And nothing in that moment would have aligned with logic. Nothing would have reassured the mind that this was a strategy. It would have felt like exposure, like being left with too little to survive what was coming.
Yes, but that's exactly where the shift was happening. Because what looked like reduction was actually refinement. Each layer that was removed wasn't weakening the outcome. It was clarifying the source, stripping away anything that could be mistaken as the reason for what was about to happen. Because if there had been more, the outcome could have been attributed to numbers. If there had been strength in quantity, the result could have been explained by force. But with less, far less, something else had to be seen. And that's where the discomfort reaches its peak. Because now, there's nothing left to hide behind. No excess, no illusion of control, no safety in numbers. Just presence. And the awareness that whatever happens next cannot be explained by what's visible. That kind of positioning is rare.
Because it requires letting go of every natural instinct to secure more, to gather more, to prepare in ways that feel familiar. It requires stepping into something that looks like vulnerability, but carries a different kind of precision. And that precision isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself. It reveals itself in the moment everything else is gone. Gideon didn't move forward because he finally had enough. He moved forward when enough was no longer the measure. And that's where the pattern connects. Because what's happening when resources are taken isn't about absence. It's about removing the possibility of misinterpretation. So that when something shifts, when something breaks through, when something happens that shouldn't be possible based on what's present, there's no confusion about where it came from. But before that moment arrives, there's a space, a very specific space, where everything feels quiet, but not peaceful, where movement hasn't fully revealed itself. But retreat no longer feels like an option, where you're standing between what was and what hasn't yet shown itself. That space is where most people turn back, because it doesn't offer reassurance. It doesn't provide evidence. It doesn't confirm anything. It just holds you there. And that's where the final layer of understanding begins to form. Because standing there, with less than what you thought you needed, something becomes undeniable. You're still there. Not everything stayed, but you did. Not everything held, but something in you did. And that something is no longer theoretical. It's proven, not by what you gained, but by what you remained through. And that changes the entire equation. Because now, what's ahead is no longer about gathering what was lost. It's about moving with what cannot be taken. And that's where the mystery deepens. Not into explanation, but into realization. Because maybe nothing essential was ever removed, only everything that made it harder to see what was.